A billionaire is about to lose a $500 million empire until a cleaning lady steps out of the shadows and speaks perfect Russian. She proves that failing to see the human being behind the uniform is the ultimate degradation, and true power respects honor over money. If you love stories where the invisible heroes rise, hit subscribe, like this video, and tell me your thoughts below.
The rain in Chicago does just fall. It bleeds down the glass of the 45th floor, thick and gray, turning the skyline into a smudge of old charcoal. Arthur Sterling didn't look at the rain. He looked at his watch. 11:47 p.m. Across the mahogany table, Nikolai Borodin sat like a monument carved out of Siberian granite. The old man hadn't touched his water. He hadn't assigned the papers. $500 million in shipping rights for the Duluth harbor. Just sitting there, cooling off like a dead body. 15 minutes. Borodin's aide muttered in English. Then the minister leaves. Arthur didn't blink. His tie felt like a noose, but his face remained a mask of absolute slate. His primary translator was currently in an ambulance heading down Michigan Avenue with a busted valve in his heart. The backup guy was staring at a stalled runway at O'Hare. Borodin leaned back. He spoke to his assistant, his Russian low, gravelly, and sharp as broken ice. "They have money, but they have no ears," the old man said, not bothering to look at Arthur. "A man who cannot listen does not deserve the keys to the water." The translators in the room didn't touch it. They didn't know the metaphor. To them, it was just a grumpy old foreigner complaining about logistics. They didn't understand that to a Russian born on the Baltic. Water wasn't property. It was life. If you didn't respect the water, you didn't get the dock. Arthur knew he was losing. He could feel the ledger slipping through his fingers. Then came the squeak. It was a small, pathetic sound. A dry wheel on a metal laundry cart, somewhere out in the marble hallway. The heavy oak door was an inch open. The squeak stopped. Clara Jenkins let go of the metal handle. Her hands were still damp inside the heavy yellow rubber gloves. She smelled like industrial bleach and lavender fabric, softener the uniform of the invisible. Through the crack in the door, she saw the sharks. She knew Gentry when she saw it. Borodin wasn't just a politician. He had the St. Petersburg cadence. The kind her grandmother Melina used to use when she told stories about the old winter palaces before the world went to pieces. Russians don't talk with their teeth. Clara, her grandmother used to say, stirring tea with a silver spoon that had survived 3 migrations. They talk with their ribs. If you translate only the words, you leave the soul out in the cold. Clara looked at the old man. He looked small in that massive leather chair, rich, powerful, but entirely alone in a room full of people who only saw him as a giant check. She didn't think about her rent. She didn't think about the rule book that said housekeepers don't look guests in the eye. She just thought about her grandmother. Clara pulled off the yellow gloves. She tucked them into the apron of her gray uniform. She pushed the door open. The hinges didn't make a sound. The carpet swallowed her sneakers. A junior lawyer, some kid with a $3,000 suit and no chin, stood up immediately. "Hey, wrong room. Get the hell out." Arthur Sterling didn't move his head, but his gray eyes shifted. They locked onto her. He raised one finger. The lawyer froze mid-breath. That finger could stop a beating heart in Cook County. Clara didn't look at Arthur. If she looked at him, she'd lose her nerve. She kept her eyes on Borodin. She bowed her head, just an inch the precise, respectful tilt of a girl greeting an elder in a winter village. Then she spoke. The Russian came out of her throat like dark honey, smooth and perfectly weighted. "Mr. Borodin," Clara said. Her voice steady despite the hammer in her chest. "Mr. Sterling does not lack ears. He merely lacks me. Allow me to translate the true hospitality of Chicago." Borodin's head snapped up. His ancient eyes widened. For 3 hours, he'd been listening to plastic, textbook Russian from state-certified hacks. Clara's accent was old. It was pure. It sounded like home. The old man looked at her uniform. He looked at the frayed hem of her apron. Then he smiled, a slow, terrifying softening of his granite face. He sat back down. Arthur Sterling turned his head. The tinder-dry silence of the room stretched until it hurt. He looked at Clara's face, really looked. For the first time in the 3 years, she'd been dusting his desk. He didn't look at her like a maid. He looked at her like an equation he hadn't solved yet. Sit, Arthur said. His voice was too quiet, too low. I have 3 more rooms on this floor, sir, she said in English. Arthur rose from his chair. He didn't rush. He moved like a shadow across the carpet until he was standing close enough for Clara to smell the cedarwood on his coat. He leaned down, his breath warm against her ear. You just crossed a line, Clara, he whispered. You changed the room. Now sit down. If I lose this deal tonight, you'll pay me back in ways 10 lifetimes of making beds won't cover. If we win, we'll talk about what you're actually worth. He pulled out the leather chair next to his own. Clara Jenkins took a breath, smoothed her apron, and sat down with the wolves. The ice in Arthur's glass had melted by 2:45 a.m. The $500 million deal didn't end with a bang. It ended with the scratch of a heavy fountain pen on thick, cream-colored bond paper. Nikolai Borodin signed his name 3 times. He didn't look at the lawyers, he looked at Clara. You have a rare thing, Borodin said in Russian. His voice a low rumble like stones rolling in a riverbed. He stood up, fastening the middle button of his heavy wool coat. You speak with the rhythm of people who know how to survive a winter. These men around you, they only know how to turn up the thermostat. Clara didn't translate that aloud. She just bowed her head, just that same small 1-inch tilt she had used when she entered. Safe travels, Mr. Borodin, she said in his tongue. The old man nodded once. He walked out. His security detail followed him like a row of dark dominoes. The room emptied out until the heavy oak door clicked shut. Then, the silence came back. It was thick. It smelled like stale coffee, expensive cologne, and the faint, sharp tang of the lemon bleach still drying on Clara's yellow rubber gloves by the door. Arthur Sterling stayed in his chair. He didn't look tired. Men like him don't sleep. They just wait for the sun to come up so they can start buying things again. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a thick silver case, and lit a cigarette. The smoke drifted up toward the recessed lights. He poured 2 fingers of scotch into a fresh crystal tumbler. He didn't ask. He just slid it across the mahogany table. It stopped right in front of Clara's folded hands. Drink, Arthur said. Clara looked at the amber liquid. The crystal caught the light, throwing tiny diamonds across the dark wood. I don't drink on the clock, Mr. Sterling. Your clock stopped 3 hours ago, Arthur said. He leaned back, his gray eyes fixed on her face. Drink it, or don't. But sit there until I am done looking at you. Clara didn't touch the glass. She didn't leave her chair either. Her back was perfectly straight. When you spend 8 years scrubbing baseboards, you learn how to sit without leaning on things. It keeps your spine from aching. Arthur pulled a manila folder from his leather briefcase. He didn't open it immediately. He just tapped his knuckles against the cardboard. Tap! Tap! Tap, a slow, rhythmic sound, like a clock counting down. Clara Jenkins, he said. He wasn't reading, he had memorized it. 34, born in Cicero. No criminal record, no debt. You've been on the night cleaning crew at the Obsidian for 42 months, before that. A laundry service on the south side. Clara felt a small cold drop of sweat trace its way down her ribs. You've been busy. I don't allow variables in my space, Arthur said, his voice flat. An unknown person in a $500 million room is a variable. I had my people run your social security number while you were explaining the Baltic Sea to a former Russian minister. He flipped the folder open. 1 page, a printout of her life, reduced to numbers and dates. What I don't see in here, Arthur continued, leaning forward, is why a woman who speaks 19th century St. Petersburg Russian like a member of the Romanov court is pulling a gray cart through my hallway at midnight. Clara looked at the folder. Then she looked at him. She didn't flinch. When you faced eviction notices and winter utility bills. A man in a bespoke suit isn't the scariest thing in the world. My grandmother, Melina, raised me, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, conversational. She didn't have money to leave me. She didn't have land. She had her words. She made me speak it every day at the kitchen table. She said if I forgot the language, I forgot where my blood came from. Arthur took a long drag from his cigarette. The ash burned red. She should have taught you how to market it. You could be making 6 figures at State or a hedge fund. Instead, you're wiping down my marble. Clara shook her head slowly. You think everything is for sale, Mr. Sterling, she said. Everything is, he replied instantly. It's just a matter of finding the right decimal point. No, Clara said. She stood up. She didn't ask for permission. She walked to the door, picked up her heavy yellow rubber gloves, and pulled them back over her fingers. The snap of the latex against her skin was loud in the quiet room. Dawn Depp cleaning up after people isn't degrading, Clara said, her English clear and sharp. It's honest. The work doesn't care who I am, and I don't have to lie to the floor to make it clean. But you look at a person and you only see a resource. You think that because I wear a uniform. I am smaller than you. Arthur watched her. His face didn't move a muscle, but his cigarette stayed suspended halfway to his mouth, failing to see the human being behind the coat. Mr. Sterling, that's the only real degradation in this room. Clara said, I chose peace. And my peace doesn't have a price tag. Arthur let out a slow plume of smoke. I need you in New York this weekend. Clara stopped with her hand on the brass doorknob. I can't go to New York. I'll pay you $20,000, Arthur said. 3 days. Just sit in the meetings with Borodin's lawyers and tell me what they re-saying when they think I can hear them. $20,000. It was more than she made in 9 months of night shifts. It was her rent for 2 years. It was her mother's dental bills, completely cleared. I can't, Clara said. Arthur frowned. For the first time all night, a crack appeared in his stone facade. Why? The money isn't enough. Mabel on the 12th floor has a son with a 3-degree fever, Clara said. She can't miss her shift, or the agency will dock her pay. I told her I'd cover her rooms this Friday, so she could stay at the clinic. I gave my word. Arthur let out a short, dry laugh. It sounded like paper tearing. You turning down 20 grand to clean toilets for another maid. A maid's promise to a maid holds as much weight as your $500 million contract. Mr. Sterling, Clara said. She opened the door. The bright, sterile light of the hallway cut across the dim room. The only difference is, we sign with our honor. We don't need attorneys to keep us from cheating each other. She stepped out into the hall. Clara, Arthur called out. She didn't turn back. She grabbed the handle of her gray laundry cart and pushed. The squeaking wheel started up again. A steady, rhythmic cadence echoing down the empty, carpeted corridor of the 45th floor. By 6:00 a.m., the blizzard had stopped, leaving Chicago under a heavy shroud of white. Clara walked 3 blocks to the train station, her toes numb inside her boots. Her shift was over. But her mind was still spinning with the rhythm of Russian vowels and the cold gray of Arthur Sterling's eyes. She slept for 4 hours in her small Cicero apartment, woke up and made tea. She didn't think about the $20,000. If you think about money you don't have, it starts to eat you from the inside out. On Friday afternoon, she arrived at the Obsidian at 3:00 p.m. for Mabel's shift. She went straight to the locker room to change into her gray scrubs. Mabel wasn't there, but her locker was open. Clara walked out to the supervisor's desk on the 12th floor. The floor manager, a sharp-featured woman named Mrs. Gable, who usually looked at the housekeepers like they were dust motes, was standing by the linen closet. When she saw Clara, Mrs. Gable didn't scold her for being 2 minutes early. She actually smiled. It was a terrifying sight. Jenkins, Mrs. Gable said, her voice dropping to a polite whisper. Mabel is off, paid leave for the next 7 days, full salary. Clara blinked. Mabel. Who authorized that? The corporate office, Mrs. Gable said, handing Clara a small black leather envelope with the Hotel logo embossed in gold. This was delivered to my desk at noon. It's for you. Clara took the envelope. Her fingers trembled slightly. She unhooked the leather latch and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream paper. The handwriting was thick, black, and elegant. Mabel's son is at a private clinic in Lincoln Park. The bill is settled. Her shifts are covered. Your promise has been paid in full. Now it's time to honor mine. The car is downstairs at the side entrance. We fly to LaGuardia at 5. Arthur Sterling. Clara looked out the window. Down on the street, parked in the slush by the service doors, a long black town car was idling. The exhaust rose in pale plumes against the gray Chicago afternoon. She looked back at the paper. Arthur Sterling hadn't broken her rule. He had simply rewritten the ledger until her rule worked for him. He hadn't just bought her time, he had bought Mabel's peace of mind to clear the deck. He doesn't give up, Clara muttered to herself. "Is there a problem, Jenkins?" Mrs. Gable asked, her eyes darting to the black envelope. "No, Mrs. Gable," Clara said. She folded the note, placed it in her pocket, and unbuttoned her gray uniform shirt. Underneath, she was wearing a plain, faded black turtleneck. She left her cart by the linen closet. She didn't look back as she walked toward the service elevator. She was stepping out of the shadows, and for the first time in 8 years, the invisible woman was going to be seen. The penthouse suite at the Manhattan Ritz-Carlton didn't feel like a room, it felt like a vault. The walls were covered in dark silk panels that swallowed the sound of the traffic 30 floors below. For 2 days, Clara sat at the long lacquer table next to Arthur. She wore a plain navy blue skirt and a white blouse she'd bought at a thrift store in Queens during the layover. She looked like a secretary, but she didn't take notes. She just listened. Borodin's New York legal team was different from the Chicago crew. These were younger men, sharp, born in the 90s, educated at London business schools, wearing suits that cost more than Clara's apartment. They spoke English with flawless British accents, but when they turned to each other, they dropped into rapid-fire, modern Russian slang. They thought Clara was a piece of furniture. That was their first mistake. They're trying to shift the liability for the environmental cleanup in the Northern Basin. Clara whispered to Arthur during a recess. Her voice was barely a breath against his shoulder. Arthur didn't turn his head. He kept looking at his iPad. How? The lead attorney. The one with the gold watch. He just told his assistant that the old surveys from 2014 show mercury in the silt. They haven't disclosed those files. They're going to push the closing date until Monday, hoping you sign the indemnity clause before the EPA reports come through. Arthur's thumb paused on the screen. "Are you sure?" he asked. "He used the word Shilo," Clara said. "It means an awl, a sharp tool hidden in a bag, a Russian proverb. You can't hide an awl in a sack. He thinks he's being clever." Arthur slowly closed his iPad. He stood up, walked back to the table, and looked at the gold watch attorney. "We're not waiting until Monday," Arthur said, his voice dropping into that terrifying quiet register. "And we rewriting Section 4. The Sterling Group takes zero indemnity for any pre-existing chemical silt in the Northern Basin. Bring out the 2014 surveys. Or we walk right now." The attorney's face turned the color of curdled milk. He looked at his assistant, then his eyes darted to Clara. For the first time, he really saw her. He saw the stillness in her face. The deal didn't collapse. By 9:00 p.m., the revised drafts were printed. By midnight, the suite was empty. The lawyers had gone back to their midtown hotels, and the silence returned, heavy and thick. Clara couldn't sleep. The bed in her guest room was too large, the sheets too smooth. When you re-used to the lumpy mattress in Cicero and the distant rumble of the L train, the absolute quiet of a luxury penthouse feels like being trapped in an aquarium. She got up, put on her old gray flannel robe, and walked out to the main living area to get a glass of tap water. She stopped near the hallway. The double doors to Arthur's private study were cracked open. No lights were on inside. But there was a sound coming from the dark. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the ragged, desperate whistling of a man who couldn't get air into his lungs. Clara hesitated. Her hand went to the belt of her robe. In her world, when a man makes that kind of noise in the dark, you run the other way. But she didn't run. She pushed the door open. Arthur Sterling wasn't behind his desk. He was sitting on the floor, his back pressed against the mahogany bookcase. His silk tie was torn open. His white shirt was damp with sweat. His right hand was wrapped so tightly around a small, tarnished silver music box that his knuckles were white as bone. His eyes were wide, staring at the empty space in the center of the room. But he wasn't seeking anything. His chest was heaving, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that rattled in his throat. A classic, isolated panic attack, the weight of his world, crushing him when no one was looking. Clara didn't call for help. She didn't scream for Julian or the guards in the lobby. She knew what Julian would do. He'd call a private doctor, inject him with something chemical, and cover it up like a dirty secret. She didn't crowd him either. She sat down on the hardwood floor, 3 feet away from him. She kept her back against the opposite wall. She didn't touch him. When a man is drowning in his own mind, the last thing he wants is someone pulling at his clothes. The snow is deep in the woods, Clara began. She didn't speak English. She spoke Russian. Not the sharp, business language of the afternoon, but the soft, rhythmic verse of Lermontov. Her voice was low, steady, a singular chord of sound in the dark room. Alone I go upon the road, she recited, her voice matching the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. Through the mist, the flinty path is bright. The night is peaceful. The wilderness listens to God. Arthur's chest gave a violent hitch. He didn't look at her, but his fingers loosened slightly around the silver music box. Clara kept going. She repeated the stanza over and over, her voice never rising, never falling. It was the same tone her grandmother used when the winter wind threatened to take the roof off their old house in the mountains. It was a sound that had survived wars, migrations, and poverty. It was the sound of endurance. Slowly, the ragged whistling in Arthur's throat stopped. His shoulders dropped an inch. His eyes lost that blind, frantic stare and focused on the frayed hem of Clara's gray flannel robe. 10 minutes passed in the dark. The only sound left was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. 5 years, Arthur said. His voice was hoarse, ruined. He spoke in English, but it was cracked. 5 years since her mother died. Every October, it hits like a brick. I can't breathe. Clara didn't ask who she was. She looked at the music box in his hand. It had a small engraving of an iris on the lid. The mind remembers what the calendar tries to hide, Clara said quietly. You spend all day being the Iron Man, Mr. Sterling. The iron has to rust somewhere. Arthur looked down at his hands. He looked old. The slate-gray eyes were wet, though he didn't let the tears fall. Julian has a pill for it, Arthur muttered, his voice full of self-loathing. A pill just puts a blanket over the fire, Clara said. The fire is still there. You have to let it burn down to ash, or it will eat the house. Arthur didn't answer. He didn't tell her to leave. He just sat there on the floor, the dawn of Chicago, stripped of his suits and his millions, breathing in sync with a woman who made $12 an hour. They stayed like that until the sky outside turned the color of dirty pewter. At 8:00 a.m., the peace of the penthouse was shattered. The front door of the suite didn't just open, it slammed against the wall. A girl stormed into the living room. She couldn't have been more than 16. She had Arthur's gray eyes, but they were furious. Surrounded by thick black eyeliner, she wore a heavy leather jacket that looked 3 sizes too big and carried a battered canvas backpack. Lily Sterling. Julian followed her into the room, his face tight with controlled panic. Arthur. She slipped the security detail at her school in Boston. She took a Greyhound to Port Authority. Arthur stepped out of his study. He was back in a clean shirt, his tie perfectly knotted, but his skin was still gray under the lights. Lily, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that stern, parental register that sounds like a gavel hitting wood. What are you doing here? You have midterms. Lily didn't answer him in English. She looked at him with absolute contempt. Her jaw set and spat a sentence in rapid, angry Italian. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He answered her in the same language, his voice rising. For 2 minutes, the penthouse filled with the sharp, rhythmic clatter of an old country argument. They weren't talking about school. They were using the language like a wall, a way to hurt each other without letting the servants understand the wounds. Lily pointed at the study, her voice breaking, then shoved her backpack into Julian's chest when he tried to step between them. Clara stood by the kitchen island, holding a fresh pot of coffee. She didn't know Italian. She didn't need to. She knew the language of an angry child who felt like an island. She'd seen it in Cicero. She'd seen it in her own mirror after her grandmother died. Lily turned around, looking for an exit, and her eyes hit Clara. Who the hell are you? Lily snapped in English, her voice raw. Another one of his lawyers, another person here to tell me how much my life costs. Arthur stepped forward. Lily, go to the guest room now. Clara didn't move. She set the coffee pot down on the marble counter with a soft click. I am Clara, she said, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. And I don't care about your father's money. But the coffee is hot. And you look like you haven't eaten anything since Connecticut. Lily blinked. The fury in her face didn't go away, but it hitched. She wasn't used to people speaking to her without trying to please her or punish her. I am not hungry, Lily said. But her stomach betrayed her with a low growl. The kitchen has those little croissants you like. Lily, Julian tried to intervene. His voice too smooth, too professional. Lily didn't look at him. She looked at Clara. "I am going to sit on the balcony," Lily said, her chin up, "and I am going to smoke a cigarette." "You are not smoking on my balcony," Arthur barked. Clara walked over to the cabinet, pulled out a small white ceramic plate, and put 2 plain pieces of toast on it. "No butter, no jam. The balcony is cold," Clara said, handing the plate to Lily. "And the cigarettes here taste like chemicals. But I'll go out there with you. I don't like the air in here either." Lily looked at the toast. She looked at Clara's plain blue skirt, then, without a word to her father, she took the plate and walked through the glass French doors onto the high terrace. Arthur moved to follow her, his face dark. But Clara put her hand out. She didn't touch his arm, she just intercepted his path. "Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice low enough so Julian couldn't hear. "You give her everything that can be bought, because that's the language you know. But a child isn't an investment, she's a person, right now. She's screaming at you in Italian because she wants to see if you break your rules, to find out what's wrong." Arthur stared at her. His jaw worked, the muscle ticking in his cheek. "She needs structure, Clara. She's out of control." "She's not out of control," Clara said softly, looking out the glass where Lily was sitting on a metal chair, her shoulders hunched against the Manhattan wind. "She's just out of ears. And you too busy writing contracts to listen." Clara turned and walked out onto the balcony, closing the heavy glass door behind her, leaving the Dawn of Chicago standing alone in his vault. The flight back from New York was quiet. The private jet hummed through the clouds, a $5 million tube of leather and polished walnut cutting through the gray Midwestern sky. Lily sat in the back, her oversized headphones clamped over her ears, her eyes glued to the window. Arthur stared at his phone. Clara watched the clouds turn into the flat, sprawling grid of Chicago. By Monday afternoon, the penthouse was a memory. The real world was waiting at the headquarters of Sterling International Holdings on Wacker Drive. Arthur's office smelled like lemon oil and old money. Julian was already inside, standing by the floor-to-ceiling glass, a thick leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He didn't look at Clara when she walked in. He looked through her to Julian. She was a temporary tool, a wrench used to tighten a loose bolt on a $500 million machine. "We have a problem, Arthur," Julian said. He didn't wait for Arthur to sit down. He laid the portfolio on the desk and flipped it open. Arthur unbuttoned his suit jacket. "Vance. Victor Vance." Julian nodded. His voice was flat, clinical. "He filed a civil injunction in the Cook County Circuit Court 2 hours ago. He's alleging predatory trade practices regarding the Duluth Harbor acquisition. He's claiming you used coercion to freeze his logistics firm out of the bidding process." Arthur didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket for his silver cigarette case. "Vance doesn't have the leverage to freeze a dime of my money. The Russian papers are signed. He doesn't need to freeze the money to ruin the deal," Julian said. He tapped a finger against a typed page. "He's targeting the process. He leaked a story to the Chicago Tribune about an unidentified foreign language specialist who was brought into the room at the Obsidian without federal clearances. He is naming Clara Jenkins as an unregistered foreign agent, acting on behalf of a sanctioned Russian national." Clara felt the room grow cold. The names on the paper looked large, black and heavy. "Clara Jenkins. Co-conspirator. I'm a housekeeper," Clara said. Her voice didn't shake, but it was thin. Julian finally turned his eyes to her. They were blue, pale, and entirely devoid of heat. "Not in a court of law, Miss Jenkins. In a courtroom, you are whatever a prosecutor can convince a jury you are. Right now, Victor Vance is turning you into a ghost. A phantom operative designed to make Arthur look like he's playing dirty with St. Petersburg." Arthur lit his cigarette. The match scratched, a sharp, violent spark in the quiet room. He blew out a thin stream of gray smoke. "What's Vance's play, Julian?" "He wants her under oath," Julian said. "He is going to subpoena her for a deposition by Thursday if she stays in Chicago. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit, specifically Agent Evelyn Foster, is going to pick her up for questioning. Foster has been looking for a loose thread in your coat for 3 years. Arthur, this is the thread." Julian leaned forward, his hands flat on the mahogany desk. "The protocol for this is standard," Julian continued. his voice dropping into that smooth, managerial rhythm that made Clara's skin crawl. We pull her off the grid, we give her $500,000. A clean passport under her mother's maiden name, and a one-way ticket to Costa Rica. She signs a non-disclosure waiver before she boards. She stays there until the statute of limitations on the civil filing runs out. It's clean. It's legal, and it insulates the asset. Arthur didn't answer. He watched the ash burn red on the tip of his cigarette. Clara looked at the two men. Two princes of the city, deciding where to move a pawn on a board she hadn't asked to sit on. No, Arthur said. Julian blinked. Arthur. The exposure, I said no, Arthur repeated. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to. The two words fell onto the desk like iron weights. She didn't steal anything. She didn't sign anything be dirty. She's an innocent woman who helped me keep a deal alive because my own people couldn't find a translator who didn't have a bad heart. I am not turning her into a fugitive to save myself 20 days of legal paperwork. Julian's face tightened. This isn't about paperwork, Arthur. This is about Agent Foster. If Foster gets her in an interrogation room, Foster can only ask about what happened in that room. Arthur cut him off. And what happened in that room was an honest translation of a legal contract. Julian, you look at a problem and you only see the shortest distance between 2 points. Sometimes the shortest distance requires you to step on someone's neck. Arthur stood up, walking over to the glass window, looking down at the brown water of the Chicago River. That's where you fail as a leader, Julian, Arthur said, his back to the room. True authority isn't about having the power to crush someone who is smaller than you. It's about knowing when to use your shield instead of your sword. If a man uses his people as sandbags every time the water rises, pretty soon he is standing alone on a hill, with nothing left to defend. We don't hide her, we protect her here. Julian closed the portfolio with a soft, definitive thud, and if Vance comes after her directly, he doesn't play by the rules of the court. Arthur. He's desperate. Then we make sure he knows that touching her is the last mistake his firm will ever make, Arthur said. He turned around, his slate-gray eyes fixing on Clara. Go home, Clara, pack a bag. Just enough for a few days, I'm moving you out of Cicero tonight. Clara shook her head. No, Mr. Sterling, she said. Arthur's eyebrows rose. Vance knows where you live. My security detail checked your building. It has 2 exit doors and a fire escape that works half the time. You a target. I've been a target my whole life, Mr. Sterling, Clara said, her voice dropping into that steady, rhythmic cadence. A target for landlords. A target for collection agencies. A target for men who think a woman in gray scrubs doesn't have a voice. If I run out of my apartment, under the cover of darkness like a thief, I am telling Victor Vance that he owns me. I am telling myself that I am guilty of something. Security isn't just about bulletproof glass, sir. It's about keeping your dignity intact when people try to make you feel small. I am staying in my home. Arthur watched her. The cigarette smoke curled around his face, hiding his expression, but his fingers were still. Julian, Arthur said after a long pause. Get the cars. We going to Cicero. The neighborhood didn't look like Wacker Drive. It looked like old brick, rusted fire escapes, and the smell of diesel exhaust mixed with cheap grease from the diner on the corner. Arthur's Blacktown car sat idling by the curb, its tinted windows reflecting the yellow streetlights of the alley. 2 men in dark coats stood near the entrance of Clara's building, their hands deep in their pockets, their eyes scanning the passing traffic. Inside the apartment, the radiator hissed, a rhythmic, metallic heartbeat that Clara had listened to for 6 winters. The walls were thin. You could hear the television from the apartment below, a faint murmur of a nightly news broadcast. Arthur stood in the center of her living room. He looked too large for the space. His bespoke wool overcoat brushed against her small, laminate dining table where her grandmother's old Russian Bible sat, its leather cover worn down to the twine. He didn't touch anything. He just looked at the room. He looked at the small framed print of the Baltic coast on the wall, the faded rug by the sink, the 2 teacups drying on the counter. Arthur's eyes lingered on a small hand-knitted shawl draped over the back of her single armchair. It was a cheap piece of yarn, gray and frayed at the edges, but he reached out and touched it with the tip of his finger, very gently. The same way he had touched his wife's silver music box in New York. He didn't look like a don examining a resource. He looked like a man who had forgotten that a home could be small enough to fit inside one room. Vance's people were here this afternoon, Arthur said. His voice was low, matching the hum of the radiator. An unmarked sedan sat across the street from 3 to 5. Julian checked the plates. They re-registered to a shell company out of Indiana. Clara poured water into a small tin kettle. They didn't come upstairs. They waiting for you to look afraid, Arthur said. He walked over to the window, pulling the thin lace curtain back an inch. They want you to pack that bag so they can follow the tail. If they think you running, they know they got a lever. I told you. I'm not running, Clara said, setting the kettle on the gas ring. The blue flame flared up, casting long, jumping shadows across the peeling wallpaper. Arthur turned back to her. Foster from the FBI called my attorneys an hour ago. She's bypassed Julian. She's going to issue a formal summons for you tomorrow morning at 9. She wants to know what you said to Borodin. She wants to know if I paid you to lie. Clara sat down at the table. She didn't offer him a chair. In this room, she was the authority. Did you pay me to lie? Miss Sterling, she asked. Arthur looked down at her. The light from the gas stove caught the silver in his hair at the temples. I paid you to tell the truth, Arthur said. That's the one thing Vance can't handle. In my world, everyone tells a version of the truth that keeps them out of a cell or puts money in their pocket. But you translated the old man's heart because you couldn't bear to hear it broken by a bad lawyer. That's what's going to save us, Clara. Or what is going to kill us? The kettle began to whistle, a high, thin sound that cut through the room. Clara didn't move to turn it off. She just sat there, looking at Arthur, while the steam rose between them like a wall. The CTA Blue Line train was loud. It shrieked against the iron rails as it pulled into the Western Avenue station at 6:45 a.m. The air smelled of wet wool, cheap coffee, and the cold grease of the city. Clara walked down the concrete steps, her hands buried in the pockets of her wool coat. The wind was coming off the lake, sharp enough to bring tears to her eyes. She had her head down, her eyes fixed on the gray slush on the sidewalk. A woman stepped out from behind a concrete pillar. She wasn't wearing a uniform, and she wasn't wearing a bespoke suit. She wore a sharp, belted trench coat and a pair of sensible leather boots. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, professional knot. She didn't look like Vance's muscle. She looked like the law. Miss Jenkins, the woman said, her voice was calm, clear, and carried the weight of a federal badge before she even pulled it from her pocket. I'm Agent Evelyn Foster, FBI Financial Crimes. Clara stopped. The commuters moved around them, like water, around a rock, none of them looking back. The invisible woman was being watched by the government. I have a shift at the library in 20 minutes. Agent Foster, Clara said. Foster didn't pull out handcuffs. She pulled out a small, manila envelope, identical to the ones Arthur used. But this one had the Department of Justice seals stamped in blue ink on the corner. This is a formal invitation to spend 2 hours with me at the Dirksen Federal Building, Foster said, her voice conversational but unyielding. It's voluntary for another 3 hours. Clara, after 10 o'clock it becomes a piece of paper signed by a federal judge. I think you'd prefer the voluntary version. Clara looked at the envelope. I don't have anything to tell you about Mr. Sterling's taxes. I don't care about his taxes, Foster said, stepping closer until Clara could smell the mint on her breath. I care about the Duluth Harbor deal. I care about Victor Vance's filings, and I care about you, Clara. Because right now, you're sitting on a train track, and the engine is $500 million of Arthur Sterling's ambition. When that train hits, it won't even feel the bump your life makes. Foster turned her head, looking at a black sedan idling near the bus stop 40 yards away. The windows were dark. Arthur Sterling didn't pick you out of a hallway by accident, Clara, Foster said, her voice dropping an octave. My office has been monitoring Julian S. Shell accounts for 18 months. 3 weeks ago, a payment of $50,000 was made to a private medical clinic in Lincoln Park for a woman named Mabel Higgins. Mabel Higgins happens to be your coworker on the 12th floor of the Obsidian. Clara's heart skipped a beat. The slush under her boots felt slippery. He covered her shift, Clara muttered. He cleared the room. Foster corrected her sharply. Julian poisoned the primary interpreter's coffee with a low dose of digitalis at 10 o'clock that night. He knew the backup was stuck at O'Hare. They knew you spoke Russian, Clara. They had had your grandmother's immigration file since 2018. They didn't find a miracle in the hallway. They manufactured one. They needed a clean, unmonitored mouth to deliver a specific message to Borodin that couldn't be traced back to Sterling's corporate servers. Foster tapped the envelope against Clara's coat pocket. "You re not his savior, Clara," Foster said softly, almost with pity. "You re his alibi. If you testify that the meeting was spontaneous, his corporate fraud case disappears. If you tell the truth that you were set up, he goes to Leavenworth for 10 years. Think about it before 9 o'clock." Foster turned and walked away, her leather boots clicking rhythmically against the salt-stained pavement until she disappeared into the morning crowd. By 10:30 a.m., Clara was standing in the lobby of Sterling Holdings. She hadn't gone to the library, and she hadn't gone to the Federal Building. She had her grandmother's Bible in her left hand and Foster's blue-stamped envelope in her right. She didn't wait for the receptionist to call her up. She took the executive elevator. Using the electronic keycard Arthur had given her for the New York trip, the one Julian had forgotten to ask back. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Julian was standing by the assistant's desk, a phone pressed to his ear. When he saw her, his face didn't move, but he hung up without saying goodbye. "Clara," Julian said, his voice tight. "Arthur is in a closed session with the board." "He says in a session with me," Clara said. She pushed past him. She'd spent 3 years opening doors in this building with a key and a duster. She knew exactly how much force it took to swing the heavy oak panel open. Arthur was sitting at the long table, 3 senior vice presidents around him, surrounded by charts of the Duluth shipping lanes. He looked up when the door slammed. "Out," Arthur said to the vice presidents. They didn't ask questions. They gathered their folders and scurried past Clara like mice escaping a barn. Julian stepped into the room, closing the door behind them, his back against the wood. Clara walked to the center of the room and threw the federal envelope onto the polished mahogany. It skidded across the wood, stopping inches from Arthur's gold fountain pen. "Did you poison him?" Clara asked. Her voice was flat, rhythmic, devoid of the honey she used for the Russian vowels. Arthur looked at the envelope. "He didn't touch it. What are you talking about?" "The translator," Clara said. "The man with the bad heart at the Obsidian. Did Julian put something in his cup so I'd have to push my cart past that door at 11:47? Arthur slowly rose from his chair. He looked at Julian. Julian's face remained a perfect, clinical mask, but his eyes shifted to the floor for a fraction of a second. That fraction was everything. Arthur moved around the table. He didn't walk toward Clara, he walked toward Julian. He grabbed Julian by the lapels of his charcoal suit, a sudden, violent movement that made the leather chairs rattle. He slammed the younger man against the oak door. "Arthur," Julian gasped, his hands coming up to grip Arthur's forearms. It was the only way to secure the closing. Vance had the backup bribed. "If we didn't change the room, we lost the 500 million. I didn't use a lethal dose. The man is out of the hospital." Arthur's face was dark, the veins in his neck bulging like thick ropes. "I told you to find a solution, Julian. I didn't tell you to use a woman who doesn't even know what color the money is to clean up your filth." "She was perfect," Julian hissed, his voice breaking through his professional shell. "She had no record. She spoke the dialect. If the feds investigated, it looked like a coincidence. It was a coincidence that she walked in. Arthur, I just set the stage." Arthur let go of him. He didn't hit him. Hitting a man like Julian was beneath him. He just pushed him away like a piece of spoiled meat. Julian straightened his tie, his breath ragged, and stepped out of the office without looking back. The door clicked shut. Arthur turned back to Clara. He looked smaller under the fluorescent lights of his own boardroom. The silver at his temples looked like frost. "I didn't know," Arthur said. Clara looked at him. She looked at the gold fountain pen on the desk, the charts of the Duluth harbor, the massive leather chairs that smelled like old success. "It doesn't matter if you knew, Mr. Sterling," Clara said, her voice dropping into that quiet, heavy register. "That's the tragedy of your life. You've built a world so full of shadows and leverage that your people think a lie is just a tool you forgot to ask for. You think you re the master of this house. But the house is running itself based on the rules you wrote 20 years ago. When a man operates on deceit for too long, his truth doesn't look like truth anymore. It looks like a trap. Arthur walked over to the desk. He picked up his revolver from the side drawer, the one he'd offered her before. He laid it gently on top of the federal envelope. He didn't look at the gun. He looked at her grandmother's Bible in her left hand. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the handwritten note she'd given him about Mabel's shift, the one he'd kept in his vest pocket since Friday, and laid it down next to the iron barrel. He didn't speak. He just stood there with his hands flat on the desk, his head bowed, waiting for her to decide which version of him she was going to hand over to the FBI. "The cars are downstairs, Clara," Arthur said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the Wacker Drive traffic below. "Foster is waiting. Tell her what you need to tell her to stay clean." Clara looked at the note. She looked at the gun. She turned and walked toward the elevator, her sneakers silent on the deep, expensive carpet of the empire he had built from smoke. The elevator ride down from the 45th floor felt like dropping into a well. Clara watched the digital numbers blink. 40, 30, 20. Each beep was a clean snap in the quiet box. When the doors opened into the granite lobby, the storm was already waiting. It wasn't the FBI. It wasn't Arthur's men either. The three cars were idling in the loading zone on Wacker Drive, their exhaust thick and white in the freezing rain. They were gray Lincolns. Not Arthur's signature black. That was the first thing her ribs told her. The man who stepped out of the lead car didn't look like a soldier. He wore a camel hair coat that was too long for him, and a fedora that dripped grease-colored rain onto his collar. He had the soft, white hands of a guy who spent his life signing eviction notices under a green lamp. "Miss Jenkins," he said. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just opened the rear door of the middle Lincoln. The interior smelled like wet leather and old mints. "Mr. Vance would like to discuss the Duluth surveys before you see Agent Foster. It's a short drive." Clara looked back at the glass lobby doors. The security guards were inside, watching the monitor, their eyes fixed on a basketball game on a small screen behind the desk. They didn't see her. They never saw her. "I have a train to catch," Clara said. The man in the camel coat didn't get angry. He just leaned in a little closer, the rain catching the gray stubble on his jaw. "The blue line is delayed, Clara. A jumper at Clark and Lake. You'll be standing on a cold platform for an hour. In this car, the heater works. And we have the files Julian forgot to show you." She looked at the dark leather of the back seat. She knew the trap was open, but if she ran now, she'd spend the rest of her life looking at the shadow of every gray car in Cook County. She stepped into the Lincoln. The door clicked shut with a heavy, pressurized thud that cut off the sound of the Chicago traffic. The car didn't head toward the federal building. It turned west, toward the industrial flats along the south branch of the river, where the old brick warehouses stood like rotting teeth against the gray sky. Victor Vance was already in the car. He sat in the opposite corner, a heavy laptop open on his knees, the blue light from the screen turning his pale face the color of skim milk. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant who had missed 3 nights of sleep. "You're a hard woman to find, Clara," Vance said. He didn't look up from his screen. His fingers were tapping out a steady, rhythmic pattern on the plastic keys. Click, click, click. "Arthur keeps his floor very clean." "The floors are clean because I scrub them," Clara said. Vance let out a dry, rattling breath that might have been a laugh. He turned the laptop toward her. The screen showed an old engineering report from 2014. The header stamped with the seal of the Illinois Environmental Protection Agency. "Look at the numbers under Section 3, Vance said, his finger tapping the glass. "Mercury levels in the northern basin. 300 times the legal limit. Julian knew it. Arthur knew it. They bought the harbor through a shell corporation called Duluth Transit Partners to bury the liability before the feds took over the site." Clara looked at the columns of numbers. They looked like the numbers in the federal envelope Foster had given her. "Julian poisoned the translator," Clara said, her voice flat. "Julian is a clerk," Vance said, closing the laptop with a sharp snap. He does what the ledger requires. Arthur needed a ghost in that room. He needed someone who didn't exist on any payroll. Someone who could deliver the assurance to Borodin that the water was clean without leaving a digital footprint on the SEC servers. You were the perfect filter, Clara. Clean water through a dirty rag. The car slowed down, turning into a gravel yard fenced with rusted barbed wire. A row of old shipping containers blocked the view of the river. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against the steel roof of the Lincoln. The driver got out, opened Clara's door, and held an umbrella that did nothing to stop the wind. "You have two choices, Miss Jenkins," Vance said, sitting back in the shadows of the leather seat. He didn't look at her. "You sign the affidavit my lawyers prepared. It states Arthur Sterling knowingly used false environmental data to secure foreign investment capital. You hand it to Agent Foster at 2 o'clock. You get a check for $200,000 and a ticket out of Midway. Or you stay here in this yard until the Duluth deal closes on Friday." Clara stood in the gravel, the slush soaking through the canvas of her sneakers. She looked at the rusted containers, then back at the man in the warm car. "You think you read different from him, Mr. Vance," Clara said, her voice steady against the whistle of the wind through the wire. "But you read just the other side of the same coin. He used me to hide the truth. And you want to use me to manufacture a lie that ruins him so you can buy the same docs for half the price. You both talk about my life like it's a line item in a budget. But a person isn't a leverage point, sir. Quien Bing Dong equality isn't something you give me in a check. It's just the fact that my word under oath carries the same weight as your $500 million signature. I'm not signing your paper." Vance's face hardened. The accountant disappeared, and the wolf took his place. He didn't say a word. He just nodded to the driver. The door slammed. The Lincoln reversed out of the gravel yard, its tires spitting wet flint, leaving Clara standing under the gray sky with the man in the camel hair coat. "Inside," the man said. He pointed a thick, gloved finger toward a small metal door at the base of a concrete silo. "It's dry. That's the best I can do for you." The inside of the Sioux smelled like old grain dust and iron rust. It was cold, but the wind didn't reach her. The man in the camel coat didn't lock her in a cellar. He didn't tie her to a chair. He just sat on a wooden crate near the only exit, a small thermos of coffee between his boots, his eyes fixed on the door. He was an old hand. He knew that violence left marks that Foster could see. Isolation was cleaner. Clara sat on an upturned plastic bucket in the corner. Her grandmother's Bible was still in her coat pocket, the heavy leather pressing against her hip like a small anchor. She didn't cry, and she didn't pace. She took off her wet sneakers, wrung out her socks with a slow, deliberate twist of her wrists, and laid them flat on a dry patch of concrete. When you spend your life on your feet, you learn that your body is your only real asset. If you let the cold take your feet, you lose your mobility. She massaged her arches, her fingers moving in the same rhythmic, circular pattern she used when she cleaned the brass base plates at the hotel. She was preserving her resource, silently, while the man by the door watched the rain. "Arthur's coming," the man said after an hour. He hadn't checked his phone, but he knew the rhythm of the city. He's got 3 cars on Whacker. Julian's already talking to the feds to buy him time. "But he'll come here first. Why?" Clara asked. "Because he's an old-school bastard," the man said, pouring a capful of steaming coffee. "He thinks if he loses a piece of his property, the whole block knows he's weak. He doesn't like Vance touching his things." "I am not his property," Clara said. The man took a sip, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "To a guy like Sterling, everything in the zip code is his property if he paid for the roof. He don't know how to see it any other way." The silence came back, heavier now that the rain was slackening. The gray light through the high, cracked window of the silo was fading into dusk. Clara looked at the iron ladder rising up the side of the concrete wall. It went up 60 feet to the loading platform near the roof. There were no locks on the rungs. She didn't look at the guard when she stood up. She pulled her damp socks back on, slipped her feet into the cold canvas of her sneakers, and walked over to the base of the ladder. She didn't rush. She gripped the cold iron with her bare hands, feeling the rough scale of the rust against her palms. She began to climb, her movements slow, mechanical, and perfectly balanced. She didn't ask for permission, and she didn't look down to see if the man was drawing a gun. She was moving herself to higher ground because the floor was no longer safe. "Hey!" the guard called out from the crate. His boots scraped the gravel. "Get down from there. The iron's rotten." Clara didn't answer. She reached the 20-foot mark, her heart hammering a steady, frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her grip didn't loosen. She was 30 feet up when she heard the heavy metallic rumble of a large engine entering the yard below. Not the Lincoln. A heavy, low diesel growl. Arthur had found the gate. The iron platform at the top of the silo vibrated when the warehouse door below blew inward. It wasn't a small sound. It was the sharp, splintering crack of old timber giving way under the bumper of a 4-ton SUV. The gray light from the yard flooded the base of the tower, catching the dust motes in a sudden, frantic dance. Arthur Sterling walked through the breach alone. He didn't have his overcoat on. His white shirt was soaked through with rain, sticking to his shoulders like a second skin, and his silk tie was completely gone. He didn't look like a Don from Wacker Drive. He looked like a man who had dug himself out of a ditch. He had a short, heavy iron crowbar in his right hand, something he'd pulled from the trunk of his car. Vance Esgard in the camel coat stood up from his crate, his hand going deep into his pocket, but he didn't pull the gun. He knew the math. Arthur wasn't looking at him. Arthur was looking up. "Clara," Arthur shouted. His voice echoed off the concrete walls, hollow and loud, like a shot fired in a tunnel. "Stay where you are." Clara looked down through the iron grating of the platform. From 60 feet up, the two men looked like small dark figures on a chessboard. "I'm where I chose to be, Mr. Sterling," she called down. Her voice was thin but clear, carried by the draft rising through the silo. Victor Vance walked through the door a few seconds later, two of his younger men behind him, their hands inside their leather jackets. Vance looked at the crowbar in Arthur S. hand, then at the gray Lincolns parked in the gravel behind him. "You relate, Arthur," Vance said. His voice mild, almost conversational. "Julian S. at the Dirksen building right now. He S. signing the pre-prosecution agreement with Foster. The Duluth deal is dead before the ink even dries on the closing papers." Arthur didn't lower the crowbar. "Julian signs what I tell him to sign. And he don't sign anything while I am standing in your yard." "Victor, you came for a maid," Vance said, letting out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. $500 million on the table. And you standing in the mud over a woman who cleans the grease off your desk. It's bad business, Arthur. The board is already calling an emergency meeting." Arthur took 2 steps forward, his wet boots leaving dark prints on the gravel floor. "That's why you always be an accountant, Victor," Arthur said, his voice dropping into that low, rhythmic rumble that cut through the sound of the rain outside. "You think business is just the sum at the bottom of the column. You think if you delete a line, the rest of the book stays straight. But business is about loyalty, sir. Tonchont Quien Congoy, respecting a person's rights isn't a luxury you buy when you re-rich. It sets the foundation of everything. If my people can't trust that my shield covers them when they do their job, then I don't have an empire. I just have a bunch of mercenary sharks waiting for me to bleed. I am taking her home." Vance's young men took a step forward, their shoulders tensing under their leather coats. But Vance raised a hand. He looked up at the iron platform where Clara stood. "She has the 2014 surveys, Arthur," Vance said. "She knows about the mercury. She knows you lied to Borodin. If she goes to Foster, you don't just lose the harbor, you lose your freedom." Arthur didn't look up. He kept his eyes on Vance's throat. "She knows what she knows, and she say what she says under oath. But she's going to do it from a room she walked into on her own feet, not out of the back of your car." Clara watched them from the heights. She saw the iron bar in Arthur's hand, the tensed shoulders of the gunman, the cold calculation in Vance's eyes. She didn't wait for them to finish the argument. She turned to the small emergency exit door on the high platform, an old fire door that led to the roof of the adjoining grain elevator. The latch was rusted solid, covered in a thick crust of brown scale. She didn't have a crowbar. She took her grandmother's Bible out of her pocket, wrapped her wool scarf around her right hand twice to create a thick pad, and slammed her elbow against the iron panic bar with a rhythmic, heavy strike, thud, thud, thud. On the third hit, the rust gave way with a sharp, screaming crack. The door swung open into the wind. The sound drew every eye in the silo upward. Arthur took advantage of the second of distraction. He didn't swing the crowbar at Vance. He drove the flat end of it straight into the latch of the Silo S electrical mains box on the wall next to him. The iron tore through the tin cover. A shower of blue sparks exploded into the dark, followed by the heavy, dull pop of a main fuse blowing out. The tower went completely black. The only light left was the thin, gray square of the doorway 60 feet below and the open fire door where Clara stood on the roof. Clara. Arthur's voice came out of the dark. Closer now, his boots already hitting the first rungs of the iron ladder. Clank, clank, clank. He was climbing in the dark, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I am on the roof, Mr. Sterling," she called back. She stepped out onto the gravel-topped roof of the grain elevator. The rain was cold against her face, but the air was wide. She could see the lights of the Chicago skyline 5 miles to the north. A long, shimmering line of yellow and white cutting through the dark clouds. Arthur appeared in the doorway less than a minute later. He was leaning against the frame, his shirt torn at the elbow, his chest heaving as he fought for air. The panic attack from New York was lurking right behind his eyes. She could hear the ragged whistling in his throat. She didn't move toward him. She stood by the parapet, her hands in her pockets. Her grandmother S. book a steady weight against her hip. Julian S. at the Federal Building. Clara said as Arthur stepped onto the roof. "Let him stay there," Arthur said, his voice hoarse. He wiped the rain from his gray eyes with the back of his hand. "The car is at the back gate. Julian S. driver is loyal to me, not him. He'll take you to the terminal and you." Arthur looked at the skyline. "I've got an appointment with Agent Foster at 9 tomorrow morning. I'm going to bring her the original 2014 surveys from my private safe. The ones Julian forgot to burn." Clara let out a slow breath, the steam rising from her mouth into the freezing rain. "You will lose the harbor, Arthur." "I lost the harbor the minute I let Julian think a lie was an acceptable tool for my business," Arthur said. He walked over to her, his movements slow, his boots crunching on the wet gravel of the roof. He stopped 2 feet away, his slate-gray eyes softer than she'd ever seen them. "You told me in New York that true safety isn't about bulletproof glass. Clara, it's about keeping your dignity intact. I've spent 20 years building a fortress out of paper and secrets, and I've been living in it like a ghost. Tomorrow, I'm telling the truth under oath, not for Vance, and not for the feds, for myself. So I can look at my daughter without having to use another language to hide the scars." He reached out his hand. He didn't grab her. He just left it open between them, his palm up, the rain filling the hollow of his hand like a small pool. Clara looked at his hand. Then she looked at the city lights. She didn't take his hand to be saved. She reached into her pocket, pulled out the small white ceramic plate she'd taken from the New York hotel, the one she'd used to serve Lily's toast, and placed it into his open palm. It was a clean, small piece of slicking, undamaged by the mud or the rain. Then she turned and walked down the concrete stairs toward the back gate, her sneakers silent in the dark, leaving the dawn of Chicago alone with his choices under the cold sky. The holding cell at the Dirksen Federal Building didn't smell like Arthur's office. It smelled like floor wax, sour coffee, and the cold grease of 40 years of desperate men. There were no silk panels on these walls. Just pale green cinder blocks that looked like they had been painted over 20 times to hide the scratches. Arthur Sterling sat on the iron bench. He hadn't unbuttoned his shirt. His tie was still missing, but his back was perfectly straight against the stone. Julian sat on the opposite end of the bench. His charcoal suit was rumpled. The hair that was always perfectly parted looked damp and wild. He had his head in his hands, his fingers digging into his scalp. "Foster has the 2014 files, Arthur," Julian whispered. He didn't look up. His voice was thin, rattling in the small concrete box. "Vance people handed over the engineering logs from the North Basin an hour ago. They re-tying the Duluth Transit Shell Corporation directly to your signature. They got us. They got us cold." Arthur didn't move. He watched the fluorescent light fixture in the ceiling. It had a steady, rhythmic flicker. Blink, blink, blink. Like a heart that couldn't find its beat. "They don't have us, Julian," Arthur said. His voice was flat. Too quiet for a man who was looking at 10 years in a federal penitentiary. They have you. And they have the book you wrote behind my back. Julian's head snapped up. His blue eyes were wide, bloodshot, and full of a wild, frantic light. I wrote it for you. I did it to keep the 500 million alive. If I hadn't changed the room, if I hadn't cleared the interpreter, Borodin would have walked. You would have been the Don who lost the biggest waterfront in the Midwest because you couldn't find a guy who understood a St. Petersburg metaphor. Arthur slowly turned his head. His slate-gray eyes were entirely empty of heat. That's your mistake, Julian, Arthur said, each word falling into the quiet cell like a small stone into a well. You think my position in this city is based on the size of the check I can sign. You think that, because you can manipulate a ledger to hide a chemical spill, you re a genius. But true authority, ding tung zua ngui, ve ngui. The basic humanity between us isn't something you can budget for. When you poisoned that man, when you tried to turn Clara into an alibi without her consent, you didn't just break the law. You broke the social contract that keeps my people from cutting my throat while I sleep. You took away her voice to save my margin. That S not leadership. That S a bankruptcy of the soul. Julian let out a short, ugly laugh. It sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. You're talking about souls. To me, we're in a federal holding cell. Arthur, Agent Foster doesn't care about your philosophy. She cares about the signature on the Duluth transit deed. The heavy steel door of the cell groaned open. Agent Evelyn Foster stood in the frame. She didn't have her trench coat on anymore. She wore a dark blue blazer, her sleeves pushed up to her elbows. A thick stack of white legal pads under her arm. She looked at Arthur, then at Julian. Julian, Foster said, pointing a gold pen toward the hallway. Your attorney is in room 4B. The grand jury is being empaneled at 1 o'clock. If you want to sign the cooperation agreement before the indictment is read, you have 12 minutes. Julian stood up so fast his chair screeched against the concrete. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't say goodbye. He walked out of the cell with his shoulders hunched, his head down, following the shadow of his lawyer down the linoleum corridor. The door didn't shut. Foster stepped into the cell, leaning her hip against the heavy iron frame. She looked at Arthur for a long time without speaking. He's going to give me everything, Arthur, Foster said. Her voice was steady, carried by the calm rhythm of a woman who had won the game after a 3-year hunt. He is giving me the shell accounts in the Caymans. He is giving me the warehouse addresses in Cicero. He is even giving me the names of the aldermen who took the parking retainers for the harbor project. Arthur rose from the iron bench. He smoothed the front of his shirt. Julian is a clerk. Evelyn. He gives what he has. He doesn't have the original 2014 survey, with your handwriting on the margin, Foster said, stepping into the light. She pulled a single sheet of paper from her stack. It was a photocopy of the environmental log, but the edge had 3 words written in Arthur's thick, black ink. Keep it quiet. Arthur looked at his own handwriting. He didn't deny it. Clara didn't sign your affidavit, Arthur said. Foster shook her head slowly. Foster laid the white legal pad on the metal table in the center of the cell. She didn't push a pen toward him. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, faded black leather book, Clara's grandmother's Russian Bible. She laid it gently on top of the photocopy, right over Arthur's handwritten note. The old leather was torn, the gilt edges of the pages completely gone, but it sat between them like an anchor. Clara hadn't given the feds a statement. She had left her book on the table in the interrogation room as a witness to the truth. She had let her presence speak for her, refusing to join Vance's lie or Julian's cover-up. She told me about the music box, Arthur, Foster said, her voice dropping into a quieter register. She told me about New York. She said you were a man who had built a prison out of $500 million and forgot where you put the key. She's not testifying for Vance, and she's not testifying for me. She told me to tell you that the floor is clean. The rest is up to you. Arthur reached out. His fingers touched the worn leather of the Bible. He didn't look at Foster. Get your stenographer, Evelyn, Arthur said, his voice dropping into that low, rhythmic rumble. Let us start from 2014. We're going to need a lot of paper by 4:00 p.m. The rain outside the Dirksen building had turned into a wet, heavy snow that clogged the wipers of the city buses. Clara sat in the rear booth of the diner across the street from the federal courthouse. The windows were fogged up with the steam from the soup kettles, turning the traffic on Dearborn Street into a blur of yellow headlights and red brake lights. She had a cup of black tea between her hands. No sugar. No milk. The door of the diner opened, the small brass bell above the frame jingling twice. Lily Sterling walked in. She still wore the oversized leather jacket, but she had her hair pulled back into a neat, clean braid, the way Clara had done it for her on the balcony in New York. Lily didn't look around the room. She walked straight to Clara S. booth and sat down on the vinyl bench opposite her. Julian signed, Lily said. Her English was flat, carrying that same tough, defensive edge she'd used when she arrived from Boston. But her eyes were clear. The lawyers said he's getting 5 years at a minimum security facility in Wisconsin. He's giving them the corporate seals. Clara took a sip of her tea. And your father, he's still in room 6, Lily said, her fingers tracing a circle in the condensation on the laminate table. He's not signing a deal, Clara. He's pleading guilty to the environmental concealment charges. The whole thing. He's taking the full liability onto Sterling International. The lawyers say the fines will liquidate the Duluth holding company entirely. The 500 million is gone. Clara looked through the fogged glass at the gray stone facade of the courthouse. The money was never there, Lily, Clara said quietly. It was just a number on a page that Julian used to keep people from looking at the silt. When you live on a lie that big, you spend all your time trying to make sure no one opens the drawer. Your father is just opening the drawer. Lily looked down at her hands. He sent me a note through his attorney, Lily said, her voice trembling slightly before she caught herself. It was written in Italian. The first time he's written to me in that language since my mother's funeral, he said. Quinbing dong vasutsutonchom equality and respect cannot be maintained from a throne built on someone else's silence. He told me he's selling the Wacker Drive house. He wants me to finish my semester in Boston, then go down to the cottage in South Carolina. He said he is going to be away for a while, but he wants the house to be ready when he gets out. Lily reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small, heavy object wrapping in a white linen napkin. She set it on the table between them. It was the small silver music box with the iris engraved on the lid, the one Arthur had been clutching on the floor of his study in New York. Lily didn't slide it toward Clara like a bribe. She just laid her hand over it, leaving it there, an open invitation. She was offering Clara a piece of her mother's memory, a piece of the truth that had been kept in the dark for 5 years. She was asking Clara to stay in their lives, not as an employee, and not as an alibi, but as the person who had given them back their language. He wants you to keep it, Clara, Lily said. He said the iris is a flower that grows in the marshes, right out of the mud, but it stays clean. He said it reminded him of your uniform. Clara looked at the silver box. She didn't pick it up. She just laid her own hand over Lily's fingers, her rough, bleach-worn skin warm against the girl's cold hand. The tea is getting cold. Lily, Clara said, her voice dropping into that steady, rhythmic cadence. Drink your tea. Then we'll go to the station. The trains are running again. 6 months later, the Chicago winter had finally broken, leaving the city sticky with spring mud and the pale green buds of the elm trees along Michigan Avenue. The headquarters of Sterling International Holdings on Wacker Drive was gone. The brass logo had been stripped from the granite foyer, leaving 4 dark holes in the stone where the bolts had been. The 45th floor was being remodeled by a hedge fund out of New York. The sound of jackhammers echoed down the elevator shafts where Clara used to push her cart. Arthur Sterling sat in a small wooden chair in the visiting room of the Federal Correctional Institution in Oxford, Wisconsin. He wore a plain, olive-drab jumpsuit with his federal registry number stamped in yellow ink across the pocket. His hair was completely white now, cut short to the scalp, and his hands were calloused from the prison laundry detail he'd requested on his first week. He looked thinner, his jawline sharp as an old axe, but his slate-gray eyes were perfectly clear. Clara sat across from him at the laminate table. She wore her navy blue thrift store skirt and her white blouse. She had her DePaul University textbook open In front of her, an introductory volume on the principles of international commercial arbitration. They didn't touch. The thick wire mesh between the tables didn't allow for it, but their voices carried through the small acoustic holes in the plastic divider. Julian is in the West Wing, Arthur said. His voice was low, rhythmic, the rumble matching the hum of the industrial ventilation fans in the ceiling. He looks at me in the yard like he wants to ask for an apology. He still thinks the ledger was right and the world was wrong. Clara turned a page in her book. People like Julian don't learn how to read a new book when the old one is taken away. Arthur, and you? Arthur asked, his eyes fixing on the textbook. The university. The first semester is hard, Clara said, her voice steady. The professors speak a textbook Russian that sounds like dried sticks to me. I have to unlearn what my grandmother taught me about the poetry just to pass the grammar exams. But Borodin sent a letter of recommendation to the dean last month. He called me the only honest mouth in Cook County. They gave me the scholarship. Arthur Mim cooed nay. It was the same slow, rare softening of his face she'd seen on the roof of the grain elevator. Borodin is an old wolf, but he knows the value of an uncorrupted line, Arthur said, leaning his forearms against the table. That is what I am learning in here, Clara. Suthatu vasusuchua lying forgiveness and healing don't come from a sudden piece of luck. They don't come from a judge signing a piece of paper that shortens your sentence. They come from the daily labor of looking at what you broke and choosing to rebuild it piece by piece, even if the wood is rough. I spend 8 hours a day in the laundry down here, wiping out stains that aren't mine. It's the first honest work I've done since 1999. Clara looked at his calloused fingers. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small piece of paper, a postcard from Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. The photo showed a small wooden cottage with a wide-screened porch looking out over a marsh full of tall, green sea oats under a yellow sunset. On the back, Lily had written 3 lines in her large, looping handwriting. The roof doesn't leak anymore. I am reading Pushkin out loud to the pelicans. They don't seem to mind the accent. Clara pressed the postcard against the plastic divider, right over the acoustic holes, so Arthur could see his daughter's handwriting. She didn't slide it through the document slot. She kept her hand over it, holding it there, a bridge between his cell and the open sea. She's speaking English to the neighbors now, Clara said. She told me she made a friend at the library down there. A girl whose father works the shrimp boats. She's not using the Italian like a knife anymore. Arthur looked at the postcard for a long time. His chest rose and fell in a slow, deep rhythm. The ragged whistling that used to haunt his throat during the New York panic attacks was entirely gone. His breathing was clean. You saved her, Clara, Arthur said. No. Clara shook her head slowly, pulling the postcard back and placing it into her textbook. I just translated what she was trying to tell you. You re the one who chose to drop the bar so you could hear her. The guard at the door tapped his heavy wooden baton against the iron frame. 5 minutes, Jenkins. Clara closed her textbook. She stood up, smoothing her skirt with that same deliberate, mechanical gesture she used when she wore the gray scrubs. Before she turned to leave, she looked Arthur straight in his slate-gray eyes. She didn't say she loved him. And she didn't say she'd await for the 3 years left on his sentence. She simply picked up her grandmother's silver music box from her bag, the one Lily had given her, and wound the key 3 times until the tiny silver iris on the lid began to turn. The small, metallic melody of an old Baltic lullaby drifted through the acoustic holes, thin and clear, cutting through the heavy, wax-scented air of the visiting room. Arthur didn't reach for the glass. He just sat there, his hands flat on the table, his head up, listening to the small music of his wife's youth as it mixed with the sound of the prison gates locking down for the night shift. I'll be here next month, Arthur, Clara said through the music. The exams are over on the 12th. Arthur nodded once, his face steady in the fading light. I'll be in the laundry, Clara, keeping the sheets clean. She walked out of the room, her sneakers making a soft, rhythmic sound against the gray linoleum, leaving the old Don of Chicago with his penance and his peace. The salt air in Hilton Head didn't smell like Chicago. It didn't have the tang of diesel exhaust or the sharp, sour bite of the limestone dust coming off the Wacker Drive construction sites. It smelled like warm grass, wet sand, and the low, heavy musk of the tidal marsh when the water receded at 5 o'clock. Clara Jenkins sat on the screened porch of the small frame cottage. The wood under her bare feet was yellow pine, wide-planked and unvarnished, scrubbed down with nothing but river water and linseed oil until the grain stood up in pale, rough ridges. It was a floor that didn't demand perfection, it just demanded work. On the table in front of her lay her Master's thesis from DePaul University. The blue leather cover was still stiff, the gold lettering catching the low, late afternoon sun coming through the live oaks, the syntax of trust, linguistic nuance in post-Soviet trade agreements. She didn't read it. She knew the pages by heart. She knew where the commas were. And she knew where the translated proverbs left a mark on the margins. Out in the yard, near the old wooden dock that stretched into the salt creek, a girl was reading out loud. Lily Sterling sat on an upturned shrimp crate, her knees pulled up to her chin, her heavy leather jacket long gone. She wore a faded blue denim shirt with the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. Her hair was loose, blowing across her face in the sea breeze. But she didn't tuck it back. She kept her finger on the page of a thick green book, Morozy Solnce, Den Chudizny, Lily read, her voice carrying across the water, the Russian vowels round and heavy in the humid southern air. Eshiti Dremlish, Drug Prelesny. She stopped. She looked up at the man standing at the end of the dock. Arthur Sterling didn't move. He had his back to the house, his hands tucked into the pockets of a pair of plain canvas trousers. His shoulders were broader now, filled out by 3 years of prison rations and the daily weight of the laundry baskets in Wisconsin. The white hair had grown out into a neat, clean crop that caught the silver of the marsh light. He turned around slowly. He didn't rush. He moved with the quiet, deliberate grace of a man who had stopped measuring his life by 15-minute increments on an attorney's billing sheet. The cadence is wrong on the second line. Lily, Arthur called out. His voice was lower than it used to be. The grit of the Chicago tobacco long scrubbed out of his throat, replaced by the deep, rhythmic hum of the river. You're putting the weight on the teeth. Dremlish. It comes from the chest, like a sigh before the snow falls. Lily stuck her tongue out at him, but she turned back to the page. She repeated the line, her voice dropping into that lower, softer register Clara had taught her on the train 3 winters ago. Arthur walked down the dock, his bare feet making a dull, rhythmic sound against the weathered gray planks. Thud, thud, thud. He didn't look at his watch. He didn't have one on. He climbed the 3 steps onto the screened porch, his fingers hooking into the latched-in screen with a familiar, quiet touch. He set a ceramic mug of black coffee down next to Clara's thesis. No silver tray, no crystal tumbler, just blue clay from the local pottery up the road. Borodin called from New York this morning, Arthur said. He sat down in the wicker rocker opposite her, his knees nearly touching hers in the narrow space. He retiring. He buying a vineyard in Georgia. Not the state, the republic, near the mountains. Clara took a sip of her tea. He liked the wine there. It tastes like iron. He asked about you, Arthur said, his slate-gray eyes fixing on her face. He wanted to know if the university had given you a desk yet. He said, if you ever need a primary source for the 1,992 privatization logs. He has 4 crates of them in his cellar that the feds forgot to catalog. Clara mime cuigne. Tell him I am done with the dead men. Arthur, I am teaching the freshman translation class in September. They re 19 years old. They think Russian is just something you use to write movie villains. Arthur leaned back, the wicker rocker giving a small, rhythmic creak against the pine planks. Creak, creak, creak. A peaceful sound. That's the beauty of it, Clara, Arthur said, his eyes turning to the yard where Lily was now throwing pieces of dried bread to a pair of gray pelicans on the dock. You giving them a tool that hasn't been sharpened into a knife yet. That's what I tell the boys who write to me from Oxford. 2 of the kids from my laundry detail are getting out in November. They asked me for jobs. They thought I still had the keys to the warehouses in Cicero. I told them the warehouses are condos now. But I told them that ngongu, vasut thohio language and true understanding aren't things you use to build a wall around your money. They read the things you use to find out why the other man is standing in the rain. If you teach them how to listen before they learn how to trade, you save them 10 years of prison. Clara looked at his hands, resting flat on the wicker arms of the chair. The knuckles were thick, the skin dark from the southern sun, but they were perfectly still. She didn't reach across the space to take his hand. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her grandmother's small silver music box, the one with the iris on the lid. She didn't wind it. She laid it gently on top of her blue leather thesis, right over the gold lettering of her name. The silver was tarnished from the salt air, a dull, dark gray that matched the color of the marsh creek at low tide. Arthur looked at the box, then at her. He didn't say thank you. He just reached out and laid his large, rough palm over the silver, his fingers covering the iris completely. He was holding the memory, without needing to hear the tune. He had learned how to keep the peace without the noise. "The house is done, Clara," Arthur said softly, his voice matching the slow rhythm of the tide coming back into the reeds below the dock. "The roof is tight. Lily's room has a desk that looks at the water, and there's a small room in the back, near the kitchen, where the light stays until 7 o'clock. It has enough wall space for your grandmother's books." Clara looked out through the screen. Lily had finished her stanza. She was walking down the dock now, her boots clicking on the planks, her green book tucked under her arm like a prize. "The librarian Savannah called me yesterday," Clara said, her voice dropping into that quiet, conversational cadence that had survived the 45th floor of the Obsidian. "They have an archive of old Russian shipping logs from the late 19th century. Port of Riga. They don't have anyone who can read the script. They offered me 3 days a week." Arthur nodded once. He didn't ask her if she was going to take it. He didn't offer to buy the library to make it easier for her. "Savannah is 40 minutes by the bridge," Arthur said. "The truck runs fine. The radiator doesn't hiss anymore." "I am taking the job, Arthur," Clara said, turning her eyes back to his face. "But I am staying here. I spent 34 years being the person who cleaned up after the world because I thought being invisible was the only way to keep my name clean. But Sutsu Bing Dong true equality isn't about hiding in the hallway until the sharks are done with the meat. It's about standing at the table with your own book, speaking your own tongue, and knowing that the man across from you is listening because he respects the voice, not the uniform. I'm not a housekeeper anymore." Arthur looked at her. The slate-gray eyes were wet, but his face didn't move a muscle. "I know," Arthur said. His voice was barely a whisper over the sound of the wind through the live oaks. "I haven't seen that gray uniform in 3 years, Clara. I only see you." Lily pushed the screen door open, the old brass latch giving a sharp, familiar ping. She smelled like salt mud and pine smoke. She threw her green book onto the table next to the thesis, then sat down on the floor between their chairs, her back against Arthur's knee. "The pelicans are stupid today," Lily said in English, her voice full of that easy low-country rhythm she'd picked up from the shrimp boat kids. "They won't even look at the bread unless you throw it right at their beaks." Arthur didn't scold her for using the word stupid. He didn't tell her to sit properly. He just reached down and laid his large hand on his daughter's shoulder, his fingers spreading out over the heavy denim of her shirt, his thumb tracing a slow, comforting circle against her collarbone. Lily didn't flinch. She leaned her head back against his shin, her eyes closing as the sun finally dropped below the marsh line, leaving the porch in a deep purple shadow. Clara picked up her blue clay mug. The tea was gone, but the warmth remained in the earthenware. The silence came back to the porch. But it wasn't the silence of the 45th floor. It wasn't the silence of the holding cell or the concrete silo in Chicago. It was an open silence, full of the breathing of 3 people who had stopped running from their own names. Out in the creek, the tide had turned. The dark water was rushing back into the grass, clear, clean, and deep, filling the empty channels until the marsh looked like a mirror, reflecting the first white stars of the southern sky. "Let us go inside," Clara said, her voice low and steady in the dark porch. "The mosquitoes are coming off the grass, and Lily still has 3 pages of Pushkin to finish before the light is completely gone." Arthur rose from his chair, his hand staying on Lily's shoulder as she stood up with him. He picked up the ceramic mug and the silver music box, holding them both against his chest like things he had earned with his blood. Inside then, Arthur said. They walked through the screen door together, their sneakers and bare feet silent on the yellow pine, leaving the world of the 500 million behind them in the dark water, where it belonged. Some characters in this story may display flawed judgment, emotional instability, or morally questionable choices as part of their personal journeys. These portrayals are intended to explore human emotion and conflict within a fictional context and should not be interpreted as guidance or endorsement.
And as the tide rolls back into the quiet marshes of Hilton Head, carrying away the last shadows of Chicago's glass towers, the story of Clara Jenkins and Arthur Sterling leaves us with a truth that is both simple and profound. A human being is never defined by the uniform they wear, the floor they clean, the title they hold, or the wealth they control. Clara began this story as an invisible woman pushing a cleaning cart through the hallway of power. To the lawyers, executives, and men in expensive suits, she was background noise, a gray uniform, a pair of hands meant to scrub away the evidence of other people's comfort. But inside her lived something far more valuable than money: language, memory, honor, and the courage to speak when everyone else in the room had forgotten how to listen. Clara's gift was not just that she could translate Russian. Her true gift was that she understood people. She understood that words are not merely tools for business. They carry history, grief, pride, and dignity. When she spoke to Borodin, she did not simply translate a contract. She translated respect. She reminded a room full of powerful men that communication without humanity is empty, and that is one of the deepest lessons of this story. The world does not need more people who know how to manipulate language. It needs people who know how to listen. Because when we listen with the heart, we stop seeing others as obstacles, assets, or tools, and we begin to see them as human beings. Arthur Sterling, for all his power, had forgotten that truth. He had built his empire on contracts, silence, secrecy, and control. He believed that every problem could be solved by moving money, hiding evidence, buying loyalty, or placing people exactly where he needed them. But Clara disrupted that world because she refused to be bought. She refused $20,000 because she had given her word to another housekeeper. She refused to run when Victor Vance tried to frighten her. She refused to become Julian's alibi, Foster's weapon, or Arthur's possession. In a world where everyone had a price, Clara stood as proof that some things still cannot be purchased. Julian represents the danger of a system that has lost its soul. He did not see Clara as a person. He saw her as a clean variable, a convenient mouth, a tool that could be used and discarded. That is how corruption grows, not always through loud cruelty, but through quiet calculations made by people who convince themselves that the result justifies the harm. Julian poisoned a man, manipulated a meeting, and nearly destroyed Clara's life because he believed success mattered more than consent. His downfall reminds us that when ambition becomes separated from morality, intelligence becomes dangerous. Victor Vance was no better. He claimed to expose the truth, but he wanted to use Clara just as badly as Julian did. He offered money, fear, and pressure, hoping to turn her words into a weapon for his own gain. That is why Clara's refusal matters so much. She understood that truth cannot be forced into service for another man's agenda. The truth must stand on its own. It cannot belong to Arthur. It cannot belong to Vance. It cannot even belong to the government. Truth belongs to itself, and the person who speaks it must do so freely, or else it becomes just another form of manipulation. Arthur's transformation is the heart of the story. At first, he believed protection meant control. He believed leadership meant deciding what others needed before they could decide for themselves. But Clara showed him that a shield is only honorable when the person behind it still has a voice. When Arthur finally chose to tell the truth, he lost the harbor, the money, the company, and the empire that had defined his name. But he gained something far more important, the ability to breathe without hiding behind lies. He learned that real authority is not measured by what a man can conceal, but by what he is willing to confess when the truth costs him everything.